Hi, I am Reverend Patricia Adams Farmer, pastor of Millersburg Christian Church, and I'm offering my sermons on Zoom during the COVID-19 crisis. My sermon for today is called Radical Sharing, Radical Caring, Radical Love. It's taken from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, so you might want to pause the video to read that scripture. Sometimes we have to do something radical. That is, radical in the sense of something very different from the usual. Something, extreme. Sometimes we have to have radical surgery to remove cancer or infection. But it's always something that happens when we're in a difficult situation, like a financial situation in which we need to make budget cuts that are radical. In the 1960s, the radicals tried to change the system by doing extreme things like protest marches and sit-ins. I know, I remember sit-ins in my high school that I participated in. It was very exciting. And some of the hippies decided to live in a radical way in communes. And there were even Christian communes in the 60s, but they, like the hippie communes, did not last too long. Humans, by nature, just do not seem to be able to sustain that kind of utopia. Being radical can be either good or bad, depending. But it is always a reaction to something that's happening in the world, whether it be a war or social change or even a pandemic. Yes, desperate times call for desperate measures. We are in such times now. Just look at us. We are doing radical church, something that is utterly and completely off the charts, weird in the context of history. When you think, if you try to show a Christian, for a time-traveling Christian from the past, what we're doing now on Zoom, they would flee immediately back to the past and report that the future is terrifying and that Christians have lost their heads, or to be more exact, the Christians are nothing but talking heads on a flat screen. But there is another kind of radical church, one that we might not be able to replicate in our time, but one we need to pay attention to. In our scripture passage from Acts, the burgeoning Roman church was doing something quite radical. It says, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute proceeds to all as any had need. Wow, now that's radical. Sounds like the 60s to me. But this was different. It was a moral kind of radical expression of God's Spirit unleashed afresh in the world. You see, it happened right after Pentecost. And as you know, Pentecost, which we celebrate at the end of this month, was the beginning of the church. So the church in this passage in Acts was in its honeymoon phase. And when you're in the honeymoon phase, the sky's the limit. Idealism is the order of the day. And I remember back in 1976 when my mom and I were shopping in a really nice boutique store in town. We were picking out some things for my upcoming wedding in June or July. I need to remember when my wedding anniversary is. July. The store clerk, a middle-aged congenial woman, was congratulating me on my upcoming nuptials. She said cheerily, when my husband and I first got married, we threw out all the conventions and didn't have any structure or even regular meals. We just ate hot dogs and cake whenever we wanted. I was impressed. But then she said, well, it didn't last long. And so, in this passage in Acts, the utopian vision of communal life, it did not last long. But this moment in time, this fresh beginning of the church, it was just what they needed to show the world what Christianity is all about. Like the song, they will know we are Christians by our love, by our love. They will know we are Christians by our love. Yes, the church in Rome was in that heady, exciting honeymoon phase. But instead of eating hot dogs and cake whenever they liked, they broke bread together every day, like we do once a week at church. This form of radical church was radical sharing, radical caring, radical love. Our modern culture is completely out of touch with such radical morality. We are instead into radical greed, radical self interest. We need a radical new perspective for a post COVID-19 world. There is the story of a wise rabbi who was concerned for a young friend who was, to his mind, becoming entirely too materialistic. The rabbi invited him into his study and led him to the window. And outside the window, a group of children were playing on the playground. The young friend looked out the window. "What do you see?" the wise rabbi asked. "I see children playing," the young friend answered. Then the rabbi took a little hand mirror out of his pocket and held it before the young man's face. "Now tell me what you see." "I see myself," he said, wondering what was going on. "Isn't it strange," the rabbi asked, "that when a little silver gets between yourself and others, you see only yourself?" That's our problem today. The love of silver, that is, the love of money, over the love of human life, makes us all lose perspective. Maybe now, in this time of crisis and fear, desperate times, maybe now it's time to put it down the mirror and get radical. Radical sharing, radical caring, radical love. A crisis is the perfect time to practice looking past our own reflection to see the vulnerable in our world and to see how much they need us to care in this time of crisis. It's a time to see the horrendous economic inequalities in our system. The COVID-19 experience has brought to light the many fractures and fissures in our society where inequality is concerned. The essential workers during this time are often poor service workers and minorities who are suffering the brunt of the risk, often with no health care coverage or adequate protection. The outrage of this unfairness should be felt for all who choose to follow the way of Jesus. The tragic element lies in the fact that, as the activist disciples minister William Barber has said many times during this crisis, there are too many people in power who are too comfortable with other people's deaths. That's pretty radical, and it happens to be true. It's time to see beyond our own self-reflection to the children playing out in the distance, who need us to think about a healthy planet for the future, who need food and clothes and a good education and health care and a feeling of being safe and secure in the world. Times like these offer us the opportunities to rethink our priorities and values and return to the values of the early church. Those values did not include focusing on their own reflection, their own profits, their own things. They were outward looking. The first churches were mission oriented to the core. They saw their well-being connected to the well-being of every member of the community. They sold their possessions to benefit those in need, creating a community in which not just a privileged few, but everyone had what he or she needed. Its members were not possessed by their possessions. They took greed off the table. They would not accept inequality in community in terms of economics. As one of my clergy friends puts it, we rob from God when our wealth indirectly or directly hurts others. Now I can't really see any of us giving up our houses and cars and iPads and joining a commune style of life, but we can surely use this time to open our eyes and re-envision our world, reimagine our social and community values, and recreate the spirit of the early church of Jesus Christ. But we wonder, how could we be happy if we're giving everything away and caring so much about our fellow human beings. Well, quite to the contrary. This passage in Acts is a vision of happiness. These were happy Christians. You can see it in the words themselves. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God. Glad and generous hearts. That is God's desire for us. I picture these folks with smiles on their faces as they pass the bread. Perhaps our scripture is telling us that this is the way to radical happiness, the kind that happens spontaneously when people put down the mirror and look at others for a change and practice in whatever way they can. Radical sharing, radical caring, radical love. Amen.